Today's agenda is an update from Broward with Dan Gold or Tara Rodgers. And then Jon Haber is going to present a workshop on the fundamentals of the Competencies and Academic Standards Exchange, focused on the Broward Equity Co-Lab. Greg's going to wrap up with to frame the Broward Gates Algebra Challenge Grant.
And Rebecca's on to here to help work with Jon and I on that. But we do have Tara. And so, Tara, do you want to start us off with any updates from Broward?
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Broward is in a planning day today for the end of the first quarter. We will start our second quarter on tomorrow. We are still in a e-learning phase. We have about 30,000 students who have elected to come back to in-person learning, meaning that their in-person is in the actual schools. They're still participating via e-learning. So our teachers are kind of doing double duty at this point in time. I'm hoping that they're all having a somewhat relaxing day today, but that's kind of where we are at this point in time. So I'm very excited about some of the things that I'm hearing that we're working on with this collab and with the information that we need to push forward on. Greg and I have talked several times about the need for getting everything in line and making sure that we understand where everything fits into algebra and the standards, whether they be standards for students on typical standards or they are standards for ESE students with what we call access points or alternate standards to what is done here in Florida. So that's kind of where we are at this point in time. I know Dan's working on a couple things. I'm hoping that he'll jump on here in a few and we'll see his space and he can give us some additional updates.
Terrific. And maybe if we can, just before we dive in with Jon, it'd be good to get a quick update from Maryellen and Alan on status of SAGA Ed rollout.
Hi, everyone. Currently, we are still just working in 5 of the 8 schools that we have been assigned. With the end of the quarter that just was happening as Tara was talking about, we are expected to be rolled out into the other 3 schools the day that quarter 2 starts. So a lot of them tomorrow or Wednesday will be when we will transition to being able to work in all 8 of the schools that we're working in. At some of the schools, we are reaching our full capacity of anywhere between 108 to 144 students. At a few of the other schools, they are waiting until quarter 1 grades are finalized in order to then transition students into SAGA based upon their Algebra 1 scores for quarter 1. So we're still working constantly with the schools to make sure that we're 1, reaching our enrollment and serving the students that most need it, and 2, that we are getting up and running on Teams, Canvas, Pinnacle, all other Broward County learning components, and making sure that we are just in line with all of the teachers constantly.
Awesome. Anne Marie, do you want to update on any other algebra related initiatives that are underway now?
Greg, I have one question for Maryellen.
Please, yes.
Maryellen, I've been asking Guy, can we get a list of the students at the 8 schools? I'd like to be able to see if they are students with disabilities as well, so we can take a look at those.
Yeah, I'll work on pulling all the rosters that we currently have for the schools and get those emailed out to you by the end of the day today, Anne-Marie.
So with respect to additional interventions in Broward County, I think that Maryellen gave a great update with the SAGA. The only other thing outside of what we've already spoken about is our Americorps initiative, which I don't think has anything specifically to do with this particular group, but that is one additional intervention that we have for specific schools within our district. So there's our algebra project, our Americorps, and of course the SAGA interventions.
And the Americorps is also Algebra 1 related?
Correct.
Do you mind just describing it a little bit?
So that was a grant that another department got, and within that grant, students are assigned tutors that will support them. Now, these are not specifically students who are in the lowest quartile. These are students who have had other disruptions in learning. So we have one school that was impacted by the February 14th shooting a couple years ago. So they're looking not only at the academic needs of our students, but also those social emotional needs as well. But that is separate and apart from what we're doing here. And it's in 8 of our schools, middle and high school, focused on students in Algebra 1 and 7th and 8th grade as well. But like I said, it's academic as well as socially, emotionally driven.
Okay, well, if there are no other updates, then we can turn it over to Jon to get kind of that, make sure that we level set an understanding around case and get a sense of how we can move forward with all of the related algebra initiatives.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think, kind of level setting is the key term here. I think case has been part of, just about every discussion we've been having with Florida, and, case is data standard. It's something that could be used to exchange data between technical systems. But I wanted to kind of talk about case in the context of how we've been using it with standards and then curriculum, and what we're talking about when we talk about using it as a way to inventory the entire sort of Broward Algebra ecosystem and use that to create a kind of genome that would be used to sort of power a variety of projects. Certainly any projects that we are describing in the Gates proposal, but really the whole sort of algebra program that we're trying to achieve. So, so just to give you a kind of sense of what case looks like when people use it. And I'm gonna just share screen here, which I think I can do. Okay, so this will be familiar to a lot of people, but for those who are not, this is the CASE network. This is a project that was sponsored by IMS Global, which is the owner of the CASE network. It's a project that Greg and Josh and the PCG team and I put together for IMS Global. But it's essentially, started as a repository of all 50 states ELA and math standards. So for instance, right now these exist, or they have existed in lots of PDFs or lots of data systems. But what we did was try to create something that was built on one data standard, which is CASE, but also trying to create some consistency and structure. So first way to think about CASE is a way to structure data. Okay, in this case, this is the original Florida math standards, broken up by grade level. Within grade level, you've got sort of domains and clusters, and then individual standards. Okay, this, if you looked at the sort of paper version of this document, it might look very different than, say, the standards, similar standards for Massachusetts, where Greg and I live. Okay, but by utilizing CASE and not just the technical standard of CASE, but also really thinking about the structure, we're able to create consistency across the different state standards, even when there's differences. Like, for instance, Massachusetts has pre-K standards. Those aren't in other states, including Florida, but was able to fit within a common structure. We're able to do something similar with Florida Best. In fact, if you look at how Florida is rendered in CASE network, you've got all your standards. And how was that done? Well, that was done by the Florida IT team or CPOM team, rendering all of the standards that were in CPOMs into CASE data. Okay, and this actually is sitting on your server, but all the servers are sort of integrated together through one CASE network. And that's the other power here, is that we can have similarly structured standards based on a common data infrastructure that might be coming from multiple sources. In this case, these are coming from Florida's servers, Georgia's coming from Georgia's CASE server, but they're all together in one CASE network. Okay, so that's one sort of power of CASE, is being able to design everything around one data format and one structure. The other area that's powerful about CASE is associations. Okay, so this is just another version of the same application. It's called Open Salt. It's an open source application. Again, Greg and his team were pioneering and getting this created and available as an open source resource. This is kind of my sandbox that I do a lot of my casework in. So you can see it's got a lot more stuff in it than what you saw before. But the actual frameworks that are in Case Network first originated here. They were first built here. Okay, and then they sort of ported over to Case Network. But one thing we've done with them while they're here is crosswalk them to a common, what we call a compendium. Okay, so if you look at any standards inside this version, you can see this standard is mapped to a compendium. And this compendium is something we map across all math standards across all 50 states, old and new, whether the state has kind of Common Core or not, or based in Common Core or not. And this goes all the way down to the high school standards. So for instance, if you look at algebra, you could see that this standard in Florida is an exact match of, or is made up of multiple components. So basically for Florida, you've put together 3 components in the compendium. And where that's important is we can do the same thing with not just the original Florida standard, but we could do the same thing with your latest Florida standards, your mathematics best standards. Okay, and again, we can map these new standards to the same compendium. Okay, so how is that valuable? Well, if we take a look at kind of what comes out of these analysis, that there's another tool that we have in our kit, which basically allows us to create alignments. So for instance, I could say, create an alignment between Florida's current math standards, its original math standards in the compendium. Okay, and through that, I get an output that could show us at a detailed level, okay, what the difference is between a math standard and a compendium standard. And those can all be kind of categorized so that somebody who is, say, creating curriculum material for Florida and wants to see if material they may have already created for Georgia or for Common Core standards, might that apply? They can look at that in detail. Okay, we did something similar for the best standards, where you can look at individual best standards and see how those connect to the compendia. And where that's important is we can also do a comparison between Florida's original standards and new standards and take a look at a comparison there. So this is a way to use the Case Network and the associations within Case Network to do something that might otherwise take lots of people sitting with documents and PDFs and spreadsheets and saying, does this fit with this? How does this fit with this? We've changed this, where does it go? To do this all with data, to do this sort of much more effectively with data. Okay, so that is one sort of thing we have already been doing with standards. So we already have like a lot to go on with standards that we could be applying to Florida, to other states, for resource sharing, for sharing of data for some research purposes. Okay, the last sort of one of these I want to show you on the standard side is a project that PCG did with Smarter Balanced. Okay, and Smarter Balanced has a content specification that ties to Common Core standards, which again can tie to specific Florida standards or a compendium. But one of the things that is valuable about this is they also provide progressions. Okay, so we can determine predecessors or procedures. We could determine standards that precede or follow other standards. Now we did this for Smarter Balance. Some of this is publicly available data. But that's another thing as we kind of start to look to inventory all of Florida's assets. We could go one step further with the standards that might be the glue to hold these assets together to determine progressions, so that we always know, somebody who's maybe struggling in Algebra 1, well, maybe that has something to do with things they've struggled with earlier. Okay, so these sort of standard by standards, these micro sort of progressions is a way to, just another sort of way to take standards and turn them into, much more sort of detailed data. Okay, so I'll pause here for a second and just ask if there's any questions on sort of case and standards before I talk about sort of case and curriculum material. Any questions so far?
I have questions, but I can wait because of the time. Jonathan, thank you. This is very helpful. This is Michael Nettles. I'm curious about the process as well as the outcome of the material you have.
Of the analysis.
So how do the who decides?
Mm-hmm.
and then how does it happen?
That's a great question. And I can't answer that quickly, and then we'll move on to curriculum, and there'll be more time for questions. But here's a good example that this is an output from that association tool I showed you. So, one of the challenges in these is that, I should share again, shouldn't I? Yep. Okay, so one of the challenges is to do these associations. You don't want it to be subjective. You don't want to minimize subjectivity, but then you also don't want it to be, ridiculously resource intensive to do this. Okay, so one of the values of this process, the first process was to kind of make a connection, do your first pass on obvious connections between a state standard like Florida and the compendium. Okay, and then we run one of these reports. Sometimes we'll do that a couple iterations to make sure we have the associations right. But then the first round of decision making is not human, it's Excel, right? If I kind of filter this list and just look at things where the compendium and the standards identical, you could see here, more than half of the Florida standards are identical to the compendium. Okay, so we've just rapidly analyzed half of them, more than half of them in one shot, right? It's no human being is involved. Excel told us they're an exact match. Okay, but then you also have ones where they're not an exact match. And that did require human being, but as you could see, human beings, a low-cost human being could tell, well, this is an and this was an ampersand, this is a different dash character, et cetera. So that's something that a sort of low-cost human being can perform that analysis and indicate that they're equivalent. Once you get more sort of sophisticated, you'll have standards that are consolidated, but you can almost see that in this sort of differential. You can see chunk 1, chunk 2, chunk 3. So again, it's when you get into the sort of ones that are in fact different. In that case, we have another category of major alignment. And Michael, I could walk you through all the details, but basically that's how we did the 50 states.
Yeah, I've got a general idea. So thank you for that in a high level, and I'd love to know more. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm a enormous dweeb on all this stuff, and love to find anybody who's ever interested in it. So, but just in the interest of time, let me kind of show you. There's a project we did based not on standards but on curriculum. Where we encoded your algebra sequence, the Florida algebra sequence, where we took actually courses, and these courses came from material that was provided by the Broward math team, where we were able to take a look at these framework documents, which that these show standards mapped to units. They also have a lot more detail in terms of what constitutes each unit in terms of all the assets that are in here. Here we primarily sort of went from the unit level, and we were able to, in this case, take a look at pre-algebra, break it down from quarters into units, break it down to clusters, and then map these standards to your clusters. Okay, now why do we do this particular project? Because we wanted to see, can we map readiness for college level algebra? And the surrogate we used for college level algebra was the AccuPlacer exam. So on top of mapping your curriculum material, we also had to map the AccuPlacer exam. Okay, and this, again, this required some, more human sort of comprehension than probably the standards did, because AccuPlacer uses its own language. In some cases, they're comprehensible through, understanding of the standards that comes from having aligned, 50 states to 50 plus state standards. But some of this also required research, some subject matter expertise to help out, et cetera. But fundamentally, we were able to map not just your course units, but AccuPlacer to Florida standards. Okay, and we can also replace these eventually with the best standards, et cetera, because they're all in separate frameworks. So this is an example of mapping not standards to standards, but curriculum material to assessment material using, in this case, the standards as the glue. Okay, so in certain case, this is really the sort of jumping off point for the project Greg said, which is more ambitious than starting with this sort of overview of your units. This is where we really want to get into all your assets, right? Your content assets, whether they're sort of core resources or some of the other resources described here or available in Canvas, in your textbook, in Khan Academy, third-party resource, whatever constitutes sort of core content resources we want to explore next. So this is really the next job, is sitting down with the Broward math team and see, as we take this to the next level, to turn this into a kind of full inventory of all your assets, what's that going to look like? Okay, and here we've been talking about content assets and standards, but there's also pedagogical assets, right? In last Friday's meeting, we talked about the Gates proposal, the challenge grant, and they're talking about content. Certainly, they want to see this all resting on core content, but it's really about inclusive curriculum, mathematical language, concepts that are pedagogical in nature. And so there's a question of can we figure out how to map sort of pedagogical areas of interest into case data, right? Because we're making the claim that we can do it, that all this can be rendered in case data. Now, I don't have your pedagogical material, since I've just been sort of looking at this for the last few days or so, but I can give you an example of how pedagogical material can be rendered into case data. Okay, I'll just use as an example some of my own work. Some people on this call may be familiar with kind of work I do in critical thinking education, right? So a book I wrote for MIT Press had a sort of high-level overview of best practices for integrating critical thinking into the curriculum. Okay, and I since turned that into a set of high leverage practices for integrating critical thinking into core 4 subjects. Okay, so I won't dwell on it, other than to use this as an example to show that pedagogy does break down into data. And as I talk about with Greg all the time, if you could document it, then you could datafy it, you could turn it into data. And this is an example how pedagogical practices can be turned into data. Now, this is an example from math. Again, I'm not going to dwell on it. This talks about the high leverage practices in detail. I'd be happy to share this with anybody interested. But the core of it is a lesson plan. This happens to be a lesson plan for teaching a math standard, classifying two-dimensional figures based on their properties. And this is based, all you math people out there will recognize, as soon as I said high leverage practices, this is obviously inspired by Deborah Ball's work, the sort of pioneering math educator who sort of is making the case that there's certain subjects or certain topics within a subject that give you a huge amount of bang for the buck if you teach them a certain way. Okay, and my critical thinking practices are based on the same idea. When you're teaching how to classify two-dimensional figures, okay, you're really teaching logical categorization. This touches what Dan was talking about like last Friday and in a previous meeting, right? Algebra is really important, but why is algebra important? Algebra is important because it's really teaching you logic. It's really teaching you to think logically. But what does that mean? Well, in the case of this standard, means when we're teaching classifying two-dimensional figures and organizing their categories, we're really teaching we're teaching logical categories, right? Categorical logic, for those of you who've kind of taken logic or philosophy. Okay, but you could do that at 5th grade level using a Venn diagram. Okay, and this whole lesson, this is a UDB lesson plan. It's got sort of content-based standards, but it also has pedagogical standards, right? we're going to teach people how to use Venn diagrams to represent logical relationships, period. Whether it's about geometrical figures or sports or pets or anything. Okay, and just to kind of indicate, so here's where you have data that can be mapped, right? We have a Common Core standard that can be mapped, 5GB3. We also have mathematical process standards. We also have critical thinking, high leverage practice standards that can all be mapped to this standard or a unit on this standard. Okay? And, you know, just to get away from Common Core, you know, that this also maps to the Florida version of that standard and all 50 standards, right? This is an example, Michael, of what we were able to do with that sort of database I showed you is I could take one Common Core standard and show how this critical thinking lesson applies in each of the 50 states, to each of the 50 state standards. Okay, so, you know, so just to give you a sense of what that would mean, I don't have a 5th grade one here, but let's just assume it's 6th grade geometry, right? Relationships in geometry. This is where those critical thinking lessons would be taught. And so I could do this by creating an association, the same way I created associations to standards, right? These associations to the math standards were created in the same way that I'm going to create associations to my critical thinking standards. Okay, and this is just a framework that, you know, a test framework just to sort of prove that, or just to find out, you know, does my framework, does my concept boil down into data? So for instance, here are the practices, here are critical thinking skills. So if I claim that that geometry lesson will kind of support explicit integration of critical thinking skills and metacognition. And what are the critical thinking skills it's going to teach? It's going to teach logical categorization. Okay, so I can continue to refine and work on these, which again, this is just a draft thing I've been playing around with and I want to use it to demonstrate. But the relevant thing here is that this now has relationships, not just to the content standards, but to practices as well, to critical thinking practices. In other words, we can make a data link, not but just between content and content or content and standards, but to content and pedagogy. This would be the way we would also, for instance, leverage mapping things like access points. Okay, so that's vital to this sort of genome, obviously. We need to kind of figure out the way to do that. So, so that's just want to give you the background here because, you know, generally the way we did that first mega crosswalk project was to really kind of jump in and do it, like understand all the standards.
So John, let me pause you because I think
Yep.
that was great, right? I think that was exactly what I was hoping you would do.
Mhm.
But I wonder whether I just want to get some feedback from people. Like, did that make sense? Richie, did you want to say something?
Well, it got me thinking. I have a question about, you know, we administer a lot of assessments from different vendors. And I wonder, is there a way that I guess the test blueprint that has those different standards and stuff can be, you know, brought into that process as well, so that we know if we administer a test with one vendor and we administer a test with another vendor that the standards behind it that are being assessed can be kind of combined.
I mean, that's definitely the idea, right? And what I can say is, I mean, broadly, we would call those reporting categories, right? And, you know, what you know, though, better than probably any of us here is that the reporting categories are often not very granular. Often you're getting scaled scores and that's it, right? Or maybe you're getting subtest scores and then that's it. You know, it takes a lot of item throughput to get more than high-level reporting categories. You need something like Khan Academy where the kid's doing it all the time and you're harvesting all that information, way more than you can do in a, you know, on-demand seated assessment. So fundamentally the answer is yes. The goal is at whatever level of grain, you know, how do we create a comprehensive learner record, you know, and sometimes we're going to say, okay, all we know is a scaled score for a subject. That's all we know, right? So, but how do we use that to then connect all the other pieces of evidence that we know about that learner? So that's very much the idea.
And Richard, I'll be definitely very I spent 20 years in the assessment business. I'm very cognizant of the sort of statistics and things that go into validating assessment. So I think obviously assessment will play a very major role in the genome, whether it's something that uses the genome to perform this particular application. I think that's what we're aiming at, is like create something that's so multi-purpose that if you want to use it for that, you can use it for that. If we want to use it to map out a particular intervention or evaluate the success of a particular intervention, we can do it that way. So I think that's why we want to kind of understand these pieces as well as possible so that we build it the right way.
Right, and I think that we have a lot of different vendors, and we some that we use a lot, where are the kids like iReady, they're on this program a lot, but the way that program reports out data is not at on the FSA standards or the best standards, right? They report it out at their own proprietary skill level information, right? So, what would it take to get their idea of standards mapped to the Florida standards?
That's the work we're going to do. And the answer is we won't know until we try it, right? And then at some point we'll be like, either, often, my intuition on this is that, I was just telling John this, 90 to 95% of the time is going to be the human process of finding the right person who's willing to reveal the reporting categories in some sort of format that we can look at, right? And then, then it's great if it's a spreadsheet or if it's data. If it's PDF, we do a bunch of copying and pasting. That doesn't really take that long no matter what, right? That's usually the easy part. It's like, and we're going to talk about this because as we segue into the Gates thing and we start talking about all of Broward's math partners and how do we bring everyone and keep everyone really at the table together? How do we make this a process which is a coming together process? Because I think that's going to be the hardest part, right? And that's.
So I have a question, Jonathan.
Sure.
I actually have two questions. One is a factual question, and the other one is a procedural one. The first one is, are you familiar with PCI and QTI standards, which
Yes.
are also part of IMS Global, I take it?
Sure, yeah.
And how do the case standards differ from those?
Probably I'm going to defer to Greg on the sort of technical kind of standards piece, because I understand that those are about sort of educational sort of technology integrating with each other, whereas case is more about educational data. On that, Greg, you want to?
That's right. I mean, the QTI is record format fundamentally, whereas this is about the record format of the outcomes. So QTI makes reference and alignments to case data within IMS.
So they're not as content focused as the case standards.
Just different. They're kind of apples and oranges a little bit.
Okay, so you need to go through both of them, or just case standard?
If you have items that you want to be written in, if you have test items, I mean, really QTI is about, I've got a test bank. I've got 5,000 math items over here, and I wrote them over here, and now I want to deliver them into some other tool, right? It's structuring those items that they can be run and delivered in a different assessment tool, which is related to what we're doing, but not the exact same thing. So I do want to, Michael, I just want to make sure that we're on the kind of broader topics though, because we don't want to get too.
I want to come to something specific in Broward and the curriculum. So presently, one of the big challenges in Broward is the passing of the state test on the state test in Algebra 1, and that's part of the focus of the co-lab. The Civil Rights Project at UCLA, under the direction of Patricia Gandara, produced 2 courses in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 that are geared toward disadvantaged population and English language learners. I put in the chat a link to the research reports from those course development. Those were sponsored by Gates Foundation support. And the question for us is, what kind of process, and they've been integrated into the Territorium platform. And Guillermo Elizondo is on the call. as well. But what process do we undergo to have those reviewed and considered for implementation in Broward?
So this is where I'm going to start bringing Anne-Marie in and, to speak for Guy and Dan and others. My sense from the meeting that we had Friday is that the focus that Jon has right now and the focus of the Gates proposal is everything that's currently being used by Broward. That doesn't need to be restricted to that. There could be things that aren't currently used by Broward that start to come in for consideration. But what we want to really focus on is what is it that's being used today in Broward, and how do we help Broward to inventory all of those curriculum and assessment assets into a common indexing scheme in the way that Jon just described.
Yeah, that's for the proposal, for the Gates proposal. But what about for the general picture outside of the Gates confines?
Well, so we'd be happy to, we're always, you can see Jon, Joshua, Jared, Dave, the PCG team, we're real geeky about this stuff. We love it. So we'll meet with anyone anytime and talk about how to caseify their information, because we believe in a world where everything starts to be able to be discoverable in these common indexes. Why don't we do a follow up on that? Because I think that'd be great to bring that in.
I've got all those documents up, so I'd love to talk to you about them after I've read them through.
We also, Dan Gohl introduced me to the School of One person last week, Joel Rose, and I met with him. They're also interested in caseifying of all of their information. I mean, the fact is that there's just so much great work done across the country, a lot of it nonprofit and, to be made available, but none of it fits together, right? And that's the breakthrough, right? So, I'll start bringing in Anne-Marie and Rebecca. So my sense of what we're trying to do with Gates is, in Richie's diagram here, which I just want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting, these are the gaps, right? That this is all the kids of the last 5 years who have taken Algebra 1, the grade they took it, and then the pass rate, right? And what we see is that if they take it early, then they tend to be strong math students and they pass it overwhelmingly. And we know for sure that these red gaps, that's where the gaps are, right? And there may be greater gaps than that, because this is a floor. This is just proficiency in math. And it's not even clear whether or not this is sufficient to have what Dan calls math intuition, right? Where you're gonna, but we know that this is when Alan and Maryellen look at this, they say, yep, those red circles, those are our, our kids, the kids we most want to serve, the kids who are most in jeopardy, the kids who most need intensive support. So how do we bring together, what do you know, Richie, and Marie, about these kids beforehand? This shouldn't be a surprise, right? You should be able to probably predict before the assessment which kids are going to pass and which kids are going to fail based on the data that you have for them. Can we put together this comprehensive learner record so that you already know who hasn't mastered these skills? And it's confirming and calibrating to a degree, but not a surprise in any way. Is that realistic for us to think about, that that's what we're putting together?
So, I mean, I think what you're saying, I mean, you're right about your interpretation of the chart, right? Obviously, in the different grade levels, there's different numbers of students enrolled in algebra at each of these grade levels, right? The majority of students are enrolled in algebra in 9th grade, in 8th and 9th grade. And obviously, the students that are performing better take algebra in 8th grade and pass it at a really, really high rate. And in 9th grade, only about half. And then if they're enrolled in 10th grade for the first time in algebra, they have a much lower success rate, right? And I think, so your question is, how early do we know that they're not going to pass algebra? And I guess the other question is like, what are we using to determine whether they are or they're not? We do have like an interim assessment that will predict whether or not they're expected to pass the EOC at the end of the year. We give it in January, and it's pretty accurate. But I think the harder question is, you know, what can be done with the students and in what specific areas are they lacking so that we can get them over that kind of hump, you know, that threshold. That's the part where I don't know if, and maybe Anne Marie can, you know, could talk a little bit more about that, but I don't know that, I don't know if it's an issue of the teachers not knowing what those gaps are in their knowledge of algebra, or if it's an issue of not having enough time to remediate those issues, you know, in time for the assessment, or that it's, you know, just really hard once they get to maybe 10th grade or 9th grade that they're missing so much to get them over that hump. I don't know.
And do you know what the number of people are in taking it in 10th, 11th, and 12th, right? I suspect that that number is much smaller than those taking it in 7th and 8th, right?
It is. It's much smaller, but it's not insignificant. You know, it's still in the thousands.
Right, 4,000 in 10th grade or something like that out of maybe 21,000 per grade cohort.
Right. There's about 20,000 per grade of, you know, 20,000 students per grade in Broward. And I'll pull up what, you know, what exactly that looked like. But yeah, we know that it's a lot smaller, but we also know that it's there are still, you know, a good amount of students that fit that criteria.
So I want to connect this to the Gates thing. And Rebecca, have you, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. Rebecca, you're new.
Yeah, no, hi everybody. Rebecca Reichert from the Grants Department, and first time at the Co-Lab. Fantastic information. I'm learning leaps and bounds. So this is great. And yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, just hoping we can segue some of this information into the Gates grant. A little sad to hear that Algebra Project wasn't able to make it today, but yeah, no, we have a lot of partners on the line, so I think we have, you know, a lot of information that we can put into this application.
Yeah. So the goal of the grant, you know, is to engage students with culturally relevant instruction. It's a $100,000 design followed by $1 million implementation. It has these types of outcomes that it's looking for, which, and these are just summaries from our notes from Friday. We have a meeting on Friday now each week about this. And, you know, the idea is that we use this thing that Jon said, right? You know, we call it the academic genome, right? Which is, you see from what Jon was saying, it's like, you have all of this different information, but how do you align it? How do you create a common index for it? And that's the work that we're suggesting that we should be doing right now, Gates grant or no Gates grant. And then it'll prepare you better for a Gates grant application, but it'll also prepare you for, you know, subsequent math adoption for everything that you're doing for integrating the assessment results that Richie was talking about, you know. So we talked about this, about kind of the target group of students. So what we said, you know, in what we proposed on Friday, and I just want to expose to a broader group here for, you know, either feedback directly to us, or if you feel more comfortable about it, then, you know, feedback to Rebecca or Dan or Tara or Guy. So what we were suggesting that we would do is that we would do this common indexing, map all district algebra assets and index with a common pathway encoded as machine readable case data. Really commit to addressing the whole child education. So, you know, part of what can happen when we do this is you start to kind of lose the forest for the trees, and you're getting focused on these very granular skills, but you're missing the more holistic values of what it goes into student success. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that, right? That we're addressing holistic, social, emotional learning objectives, at least equally with the granular skill-based. specifically teaching critical thinking. Jon happens to have some expertise in that area. Algebra projects bringing a lot of that. We want to create a framework and a language to talk about math intuition, not just math facts. And then provide intensive tutoring, really learning from this experience with SAGA, as well as perhaps Americorps and any other tutoring programs about what happens. I mean, if it's one thing to say, okay, we predict that these kids are going to be at risk. Well, what do we do about it then? If we know that they're at risk, then are we able to marshal additional resources in order to provide them with support now before they are really, forked into the wrong direction for life? Embed assessments into all learning activities. Michael, this is where hoping that you guys can really come in, and look at that interim assessment that Richie talked about and think about when Jon creates a case sort of backbone for these algebra pathways with access points. Can we create a set of testlets that all along the way are accumulating additional pieces of evidence? It's better to know in the interim in January than to wait for the end. It's even better to know all along exactly where each learner is and be able to make mid-course corrections, additional supports accordingly. So fundamentally putting in place a comprehensive learner record to manage achievement assertions in a secure digital wallet application owned and controlled by the learner and their adult guardian. And that's really what for the past year and a half we've been all talking about, is the comprehensive learner record as a structure for that. So this Equity Co-Lab, which purports to be a partnership of Broward County Public Schools, Broward College, Greater Fort Lauderdale Alliance. I don't think we have anyone from Broward College here today. Maria's not here, and Frank was a maybe, but we'll reach back out to them, keep them involved. So it's about integrating all these things together. So anyway, so that's what we're thinking. Jon's going to begin really writing this up with Rebecca, the answers to the 29 questions. But does anyone have any feedback to this general direction, or anything that anyone wants to say?
I was just, because when you were speaking, it really made me think about unfortunately, I think we're at the third year of a 3-year grant with the Community Foundation of Broward. And it wasn't specifically geared towards algebra, but it was definitely geared towards, student achievement and looking at the lowest quartile. So I just thought I would put that out there. I think we are in the works to extend the work, obviously, because of the pandemic. Some things that should have gotten done, didn't get done, but I just thought I would put that on the radar. I don't know if we can include them in further conversations. I think they would be really excited about this type of work. So yeah, Community Foundation of Broward, that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah. I think our plan was to connect with them over the summer. And there was a personal tragedy in the foundation director's life. I believe that held up that connection. If I'm connecting the dots.
Good to know. I mean, not about the tragedy, the connection.
Yeah. Anne Marie, do you want to speak for math about this?
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were presenting some of the work, and you asked the question about, is there a way to kind of predict that our students will end up in that red area as they get through 11th and 12th grade, 10th as well. And I started to think about our response to intervention, where students at various levels, depending on their performance in an FSA or a diagnostic or any kind of assessments, are supporting through that response to intervention. I could see this work that's being done now kind of going hand in hand with that component where students are supported because of predicted deficiency or just something that they're showing in terms of their own learning. And I thought about our own response to intervention program that we have in our schools right now to support the work that's happening. And as you were going through and you're asking, okay, can you predict this? And essentially, yes, which is why we should be able to put an intervention in place that meets the needs of the students. One of the things that we've recognized in our schools, particularly the transition from 5th grade to 6th grade, is just the support that students have or lose once they make that transition from 5th grade. When we think about those 5th grade standards, they're very much so conceptual in nature. But when you transition to the middle school or at high school, it becomes a little bit more procedural. And our teachers from prior years are used to sometimes having the students come with some of those skills, which they don't have because it was not a part of the expectation. And sometimes there is a little bit of a divide in terms of that transition. Something else to consider around what's going on here is when we adopted our current instructional materials, which are now outdated by 2 years, the standards were relatively new. So the resources that were secured did not align 100% with the standards. So that's why when you look at our scope and sequence, we have a little bit of our Common Core, but a lot of other resources to help fill those gaps. So those are some of the things that, you know, we could definitely benefit from correcting, fixing, improving based on some of the work that you all have presented in terms of the lesson plans that come around critical thinking and so on. But I'm just sharing a few thoughts that kind of came to mind as you all were presenting.
That's excellent. Well, I think, Anne-Marie, if you're willing to do some follow-up with Jon, he's ready to take everything, you know, that you provide and then, you know, process it into these case alignments and then get it back to you and your team to review.
Sure, we'll make that time to connect.
Yeah, I'd love to connect with you.
Yeah.
So deep.
And just before we end, you know, I think, you know, Michael and, you know, I think Guy is also kind of working on this. I'm not sure what, you know, we want to keep on the outreach to Algebra Project to make sure that they're involved in the way that they want to be involved. And if that's not wanting to be involved, then you know, that's up, you know, up to them, obviously. So we've had a few meetings. I don't know whether they're just meeting collisions or there's anything that we can do to, you know, just to affirm our common commitment for the work that we're doing. So, Michael, you're talking, but on mute.
Yeah, Jonathan, if I put my email.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was just looking up your email. Oh, you just muted again. Oh, Michael, you're muted again.
Sorry about that. If you have materials that you could share that you presented today, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
That'll help me a lot. And then Greg, on this meeting coincided with the balanced equation meeting today. There was an informational session by Gates on balanced equation at 2 p.m. today. Cliff Freeman is on the line from Young People's Project. I don't know if anybody else is on from Algebra Project, but we met this morning and we're moving forward with trying to integrate everything and make progress. There were 2 proposals submitted to NSF last week that related to Broward. One, I think Aurora Graff is principal investigator from ETS, and I think Greg Budsman may be the other principal investigator. So, but it was great to hear Jonathan today. I'm sorry that people missed this because I think this is going to be really important.
Well, good news though, because Rob will have this posted to YouTube within a couple hours, and so, you know, that's the idea, is that, you know, people have a lot of different things and we want to start getting to the point where we can share these and more specifically say what's in it, you know, what part to watch, etc. So,
and Guillermo's on the phone. He may have something to say real quick. I don't know.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, Daryl from our team is on the meeting.
Okay, Daryl. Okay.
Around the Gates meeting that was on at the same time. So, and we're also working with Algebra Project and Young People Project to write to basically to write the proposal for the Gates grant.
And just so you know, also Guillermo is working with Peter Timms from Durham University in the UK on early learning of math, because as you know, algebra is easier to learn when you've had a great foundation in kindergarten, right, all the way up through. And so they're working on that, and be happy to demonstrate some of that anytime people want to see it. But that wouldn't be part of the Gates initiative, but need to find funding for it otherwise.
Okay, we're going to bring this meeting to end because we want to end on time. But thanks everyone for your participation, and you'll be hearing from us, and we'll be back next week continuing the work. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, great talking to everybody. Take care.
Thank you.